a lot of the debate we've had around sexual offender policy generally has been somewhat acrimonious at times. Um, on one side, we have a group that is perceived by the other as being reactive, being overly punitive, being resistant to integrating evidence. We tend to talk about the fact that our policies, our public policies, are kind of knee-jerk reactions to these very extreme events, and I'm going to get into some of that. On the other side, those who are on the other side are often viewed as being soft on offenders and not quite in tune with reality. And this is a lot of the discourse that's kind of permeated our public policy discussion around sexual offending. And I want us to today try to move a little bit beyond that. When we're talking about criminal justice-based policies, they tend to be mostly driven by statute. Okay? It's legislation that is passed. They have to be implemented down there. And we're talking mostly about criminal codes. In some cases, we have civil processes. I'll get into those in a minute. The public health and human services sector tends to be a little bit more kind of ground up. The innovations and the kinds of policies that we see, hopefully, and this is not always the case, but are mostly driven by kind of emerging programs, emerging practices, what works. And I will argue that it's a sector that is probably a bit more receptive and conducive to the implementation of evidence-based practice. When we talk in terms of the realm of prevention, mostly when we're talking about criminal justice responses, we're talking about what we call tertiary prevention. Okay, it's where basically something has happened, we're trying to respond and intervene, and the public health approach obviously comes at things from a very different angle, and the emphasis is mostly, ideally, and this is what we're going to talk about a lot today, is primary and secondary. And then we obviously are working in different kinds of activity domains. Beginning in the early 2000s, we saw a sequence of legislation that began to put additional federal focus on this, and the states have kind of followed suit. Okay, so again, this is something that I think really began at the federal level, and states over the years have been passing very significant state laws combating human trafficking, and a lot of this has happened in very recent years. Second major domain where we see, again, what we would consider to be, some form of prevention of the exploitation of children is in the realm of child pornography and internet-based sexual exploitation of kids. The child pornography laws date back to the 1970s, and over the years, we've seen a sequence of federal activity where there's been increasing federal focus. I'm going to show you some data in a little while about the federal prison system and what's been going on there. But the prosecution and the disruption of child pornography networks has become a major initiative. When we take a step back and we look at these policies that really began in the 1990s, and we've seen, we're now about a quarter century in, we can kind of put them into two major kind of buckets. The first are what we call institutional strategies, and the second are community-based. Institutional strategies basically means locking people up, incapacitating them so that they can't harm anybody. Okay? As I mentioned, Washington passed the nation's first sexual predator civil commitment law in 1990. 21 states have followed suit, and the federal government followed suit in 2006. And the basic idea here is this is actually not the use of the criminal justice system. It's the use of the public mental health system to hold offenders after they have been released from custody. And the whole idea was that these were individuals who somehow slipped through the cracks, who needed to be held, and it's post-release confinement for these folks. Second way to obviously lock people, the second thing is obviously to lock people up, and we've seen some significant trends in sentencing for sexual offenders over the last 20 years. And some of these have crosswalked with broader sentencing trends that we've seen for violent offenders in general, but I'm going to show you in a few minutes how those who committed sexual offenses are somehow really kind of disproportionately affected. Longer mandatory sentences and sentencing guidelines have been put in place. We've seen a number of sentencing reforms. There's these laws called truth in sentencing, and the whole idea is that if someone gets convicted to 10 years, they should be serving 10 years or close to it. Okay, part and parcel to that has been a reduction in the ability for people to get parole. In the old days, it used to be people would go in front of a parole board, and that would make a decision about whether they were due to be released. But what's happened is through legislation, the legislatures have very gradually chipped away at the discretion that judges, prosecutors, and parole boards have, and so a lot of this stuff is now codified into law. Now, are these policies good policies or bad policies? Well, this is kind of a matter of perspective, right? We've spent a lot of time trying, and this is a whole other talk, but we spent a lot of time trying to evaluate, from an empirical standpoint, whether these policies are working, and I think the jury's still out. Okay, there's a lot of evidence for and against, but we have to realize that the evidence is kind of just one part of the picture. Okay, we have these things like the concept of justice, okay, and who that justice is for is a really critical piece. And so this question about whether we're on the right path or not is something that we're going to need to debate and discuss. So where are we heading? So far I've painted a picture where we're talking about longer sentences, more monitoring and supervision than any other population, okay? And I think we can kind of put all of that into what we call a relatively reactive kind of punitive bucket, okay? Because what we really need to be doing is thinking about how all these elements can be integrated into a cohesive whole, okay? The fact that we always are going to be having justice responses that are kind of reinforcing our values and keeping kids safe. And those things can really work well in tandem with all these other kinds of things that we're going to be talking about today.